In 2010, a 6-year-old boy vanished while walking home during a sudden blizzard in rural Colorado. Despite a massive search, only a red mitten was ever found until 12 years later, when a hiking dog uncovers a rusted lunchbox in a snowy hollow, triggering a haunting investigation that exposes a decades-old trail of secrets, a forgotten cabin in the woods, and the truth behind what really happened to Evan Benton. The snow was falling in soft, lazy spirals as Laura Benton zipped her son's coat up to his chin and pulled the hood over his head. Evan giggled at the puff of warm air that escaped her gloves when she tugged the drawstrings tight. It was a Monday afternoon in early February, and the storm had arrived earlier than forecasted, blanketing the small mountain town of Pine Hollow in thick, white silence. Still, the walk from the elementary school to their modest cabin was short, barely half a mile along a wooded path they'd taken together countless times. Laura would have picked him up herself if she hadn't been stuck on the phone with the utility company, arguing about a misread meter and overdue notice. She glanced at the clock on the wall. It had been 20 minutes since Evan left with Liam Rollins, a responsible 12-year-old neighbor who sometimes walked with him. 20 minutes was longer than it should have taken. Laura stepped onto the porch and squinted through the falling snow, her breath misting in the frigid air. The world was white and quiet, wrapped in that eerie stillness that only comes in a blizzard. When Liam arrived alone, red-faced and panting, Laura's heart sank before he said a word. He stammered through the explanation. Evan had taken the shortcut trail that curved around the frozen creek, wanting to race him home. Liam thought he'd meet him at the other side, like always, but Evan hadn't been there. That night, the wind howled against the siding like a wounded animal, and Laura stood outside in snow up to her knees, screaming her son's name until her voice cracked. By dawn, dozens of volunteers had joined the search. Tracking dogs picked up his scent at the trailhead, but it vanished at the hollow near the base of the ridge where the wind blew hardest. 2 days later, they found a single red mitten caught on a low branch, stiff with ice. It was the only thing that ever surfaced. For 12 years, Laura had lived with that silence. No body, no trace. Just winter, returning each year like clockwork, always heavier than the last. 12 years later, the snow had returned, this time without warning. By mid-morning, the sun had vanished behind a curtain of gray, and the forest along Pine Hollow's northern ridge was blanketed in white. Jonas Meyer, a retired firefighter and avid hiker, made his way through the trailhead with his dog Scout trotting ahead. Scout was a 7-year-old golden retriever with a nose that never missed a thing and energy that never seemed to fade. Jonas had trained him as a search and rescue dog after losing his own son in a car crash 7 winters earlier. Hiking these woods had become their shared therapy, their way of staying moving when the silence tried to swallow them whole. They had been out for about an hour when Scout suddenly stopped. His nose dipped low to the ground, and his ears flattened, tail stiff as a board. Jonas followed the dog's line of sight to a shallow hollow, half covered by a tangle of pine and snowdrift. Scout whined and began digging furiously, snow spraying in every direction. Jonas moved closer, unsure whether Scout had caught the scent of an animal or something buried long ago. As the snow was pushed away, a dull metallic edge came into view. Jonas crouched beside the dog, brushing the snow back with his gloves. What emerged looked like an old lunchbox, the kind kids used to carry in the early 2000s, with faded cartoon stickers barely visible beneath the rust and grime. Jonas's stomach turned. He carefully lifted it free, inspecting the hinges. It was sealed shut, but not locked. His fingers trembled slightly as he unlatched the lid and slowly opened it. Inside were small, brittle remains wrapped in a shredded piece of cloth. A pair of cartoon socks, the pattern faded beyond recognition, clung to what looked like bone. He stepped back instinctively, his breath catching in his throat. Scout sat beside him, still and silent now, eyes fixed on the box, as if he too understood the weight of what they had uncovered. Jonas reached for his phone with numb fingers and dialed the sheriff's office. His voice cracked as he gave his location. Something had finally surfaced in Pine Hollow, and it had waited 12 winters beneath the snow. The call came just after noon. Sheriff Ellen Griggs had been halfway through her lunch when the deputy handed her the phone with a pale face and a single word: bones. The hiker had found something off the trail near Ridge Hollow, where the wind always howled and the snow never melted quite right. She didn't need to ask for a name. Her mind leapt instantly to one case, the one that had haunted this town longer than any other: Evan Benton. Within 30 minutes, the trailhead was cordoned off, and a forensic team was hiking through thigh-deep snow, guided by Jonas Meyer, who still looked shaken. Scout had been secured in Jonas's truck, pacing and whimpering as if he sensed the gravity of what his discovery meant. Sheriff Griggs stood in the hollow with her boots sunk into the frozen ground and stared at the rusted lunchbox that now sat open atop a blue tarp. The medical examiner, Dr. Lynn Tran, knelt beside the remains, working carefully. She didn't speak at first, just catalogued, photographed, and handled the items with the kind of quiet reverence that came from years of recovering the lost. Finally, she looked up at the sheriff, her expression grim. There were fragments of bone, brittle and discolored, tucked among a child-sized jacket and the remains of a small cloth backpack. Inside the backpack was a school photo, sealed in a plastic sleeve, curled with age but still legible. A boy with soft eyes and a crooked front tooth smiled at the camera, a classroom border framing his face. His name, Evan B., was printed in the corner in thick marker. Sheriff Griggs felt the weight settle in her chest like packed snow. It had been 12 years since Evan walked into that storm and never came home. 12 years of unanswered questions, false leads, and long silences, broken only by the sound of Laura Benton crying during interviews that always ended the same way. Griggs reached for her radio. Her voice was low, steady. She asked dispatch to contact Laura immediately. Not with confirmation, not yet, just that they'd found something, and that she needed to come in. In Pine Hollow, hope and heartbreak had always worn the same face. Laura sat at her kitchen table, hands wrapped around a chipped mug of tea gone cold. She hadn't touched it in over an hour. The snow outside had picked up again, swirling past the window like a slow-moving curtain. She stared through it, lost in a familiar place between numbness and dread. The phone call from the sheriff's office had been brief. Something had been found off Ridge Hollow, and they needed her to come in. She didn't ask what. She didn't need to. 12 years ago, Ridge Hollow was where the dogs lost Evan's trail. She had stood in that very spot then, screaming his name until her voice bled raw and the world blurred through tears. And now, 12 years later, someone was asking her to return, to look at something pulled from the snow, like a message scrawled across time. Her hands shook as she buttoned her coat. She didn't bother with makeup or fixing her hair. The mirror offered a face that had already wept every tear it was owed. At the sheriff's office, the lobby smelled of old coffee and pine cleaner. Sheriff Griggs stood waiting, her face carved from stone, but her eyes soft with apology. She didn't speak right away, just motioned for Laura to follow. In the back, a plain room had been cleared for the evidence. On the table sat a sealed bag containing the rusted lunchbox and a smaller bag with its contents carefully preserved. Laura's gaze landed first on the jacket. Faded denim, too small for any child now, with one pocket stitched over in blue thread. She had sewn that patch herself the winter Evan lost his marble collection in the school parking lot. He'd kept one special marble in that pocket for weeks after. Then she saw the photograph. It was Evan's school picture from the fall, before he vanished. His front teeth still growing in, hair combed in careful waves she had smoothed that morning. And on the back of the photo, someone had written in shaky block letters, "I'm sorry, I tried." Laura didn't speak. Her breath hitched, and she reached out to steady herself on the table's edge. The storm outside had shifted, but inside her it was only beginning again. Laura sat in the sheriff's office long after the evidence bags were sealed again, her fingers pressed together tightly in her lap. Sheriff Griggs had offered her water, a blanket, even someone to sit with her, but she had declined everything. Nothing could warm her. Not yet. The sight of Evan's jacket, the photo, The handwriting she didn't recognize but couldn't ignore it had scraped open something that had long scabbed over. It wasn't just grief. It was confusion, fear, a flicker of something darker. "I want to see where they found it," she said finally, her voice dry and hollow. Griggs hesitated, then nodded. "Give us until morning. We're securing the site overnight, and Dr. Tran wants to finish examining the scene. But I'll take you myself, Laura, I promise." That night, Laura didn't go home. She checked into a roadside motel on the edge of town, the same one where she had stayed for 2 weeks during the original search, unwilling to return to a house that felt too empty. The clerk recognized her instantly and didn't ask questions. She laid on top of the covers fully dressed, her eyes never closing. By morning the snow had softened, the sharp wind giving way to a quiet stillness. Sheriff Griggs picked her up just after sunrise, and together they drove in silence toward Ridge Hollow. The forest, once so familiar, looked like a memory stretched too thin. Trees bowed under the weight of the storm, and animal tracks lined the trailhead like forgotten signatures. They reached the hollow by snowshoe, weaving between pine trunks until the ground dipped and flattened. Flags marked the perimeter, neon against the white. Laura stopped at the edge. The indentation in the snow where the lunchbox had been uncovered was still visible, a shallow wound in the earth. "This is where he was?" she asked. Griggs nodded quietly. "This is where the dog found him." Laura stepped forward, letting her eyes trace every branch, every drift, searching for something she couldn't name. She knelt, scooping up a handful of snow, letting it melt between her fingers. "He wasn't alone out here," she whispered. And somehow, in her bones, she knew she was right. Back at the sheriff's office, Dr. Lynn Tran stood beneath the harsh fluorescent lights of the evidence room, gently laying out the contents of the lunchbox on a sterile steel table. She worked slowly, her gloved hand steady, her breath even. The air was heavy with silence, broken only by the low hum of the overhead fan and the occasional scribble of notes. The remains were partial but significant. Bones consistent with a child around 6 years old. The condition was typical of a long-term exposure case, fragile, brittle, and discolored from years of moisture and frost. The jacket had preserved more than expected. Inside one of the inner pockets, folded so tightly it was nearly fused to the fabric, she found a single page torn from a school notebook. She carefully peeled it open. The ink had bled in spots, but a message remained, written in uneven lines, the pencil strokes shaky. "His name is Evan. I tried to keep him warm. I didn't know what else to do. I'm sorry." The signature at the bottom was just an A. Dr. Tran leaned back from the table, her brow furrowed. This wasn't a solitary death. Someone had been with him, someone who had tried, at least by their own account, to save him. She snapped a photo and reached for the phone. Sheriff Griggs answered on the first ring. "There's more," Tran said. "I found a note. It was written by someone else." Griggs was quiet for a moment. "How recent does it look?" "It's old. Papers deteriorated, but it was sealed inside the jacket pocket. Same jacket the bones were wrapped in. I think whoever wrote it was there with him, maybe even after he died." "Do you think it could be a second child?" Griggs asked. "I do. Based on the handwriting, the phrasing, it reads like a child trying to explain something too big for them." Griggs closed her eyes and exhaled slowly. "God, we never even considered the possibility of another kid." As she hung up, Dr. Tran looked again at the crumpled paper, now laid flat beneath a weighted frame. Someone else had been out there in the storm, and that someone had never come forward. The school photo sat on the desk in front of Sheriff Griggs, its edges curling from time and moisture. Evan's smile beamed through the years, innocent and frozen, a stark contrast to the brittle remains now resting in the county morgue. But it was the other boy in the picture who now held her attention. He stood to the side, slightly out of focus, as if he hadn't been meant to be in the shot. Griggs leaned in, squinting. She didn't recognize him, not right away. There were no labels, no class list, just a name written in thick marker across the back. Ms. Langston's, Grade 1, 2009. She picked up her phone and dialed the elementary school. After several transfers, she was patched through to an administrative assistant who'd been there long enough to remember faces and names most had forgotten. "I'm looking at a first-grade class photo from 2009, Griggs said. "Ms. Langston's class? Do you have the student records from that year?" The woman paused. "That's going back a ways. But I think we still have hard copies stored in the basement." "What are you looking for?" "There's a boy in the picture, not Evan Benton, another one. Dark hair, pale. He's off to the side like he joined at the last second." A few hours later, a scanned copy of the class roster landed in Griggs's inbox. She went down the list, matching names to faces, until she reached the last one, Aiden Marsh. She typed the name into the old incident database, not expecting much. But a single file popped up. It was thin, just a missing persons report from late March 2010, filed 3 weeks after Evan had disappeared. Griggs frowned. Aiden Marsh had vanished walking home from a different neighborhood. No signs of foul play, no one had linked his disappearance to Evan's, and at the time, the cases had been treated separately. Different locations, different circumstances. But now, with that note in Dr. Tran's hands, everything felt connected. Griggs leaned back in her chair, a cold unease crawling through her chest. There hadn't just been one child in those woods, and the second one had never come home either. Jonas Meyer had returned to the trail the next morning, though this time not with any intention of hiking. Scout sat in the passenger seat, unusually quiet, watching the trees blur past the window. Jonas hadn't slept much. He kept seeing the lunchbox in his dreams, hearing the creak of the lid as it opened, the slow exhale of the past being unearthed. The sheriff's office had asked if he'd be willing to meet with their forensic team again, maybe help retrace his steps. Jonas had agreed, though part of him already knew Scout had found something no human could have. That dog had dug with purpose, not curiosity. He'd smelled not just death, but memory, something pressed into the frozen ground for over a decade. They parked at the base of the trailhead and met the deputy waiting with a clipboard and high boots. The snow had settled again, soft and thick, making everything look fresh and untouched despite the trauma buried beneath it. Scout jumped down from the truck and immediately sniffed the air. His ears perked. He pulled toward the trees. "Hold up, boy," Jonas said, looping the leash tighter. But Scout strained forward, dragging him just a few feet off the marked trail. The dog stopped, pawed at the snow, and let out a low whine. The deputy stepped beside them, his breath fogging. "Same spot?" Jonas shook his head. "No, this is different." The deputy radioed for a second unit and knelt where Scout had scratched. Beneath the surface something pale and rectangular emerged. Jonas brushed it off. A composition notebook, the kind handed out in classrooms by the dozen. He opened it slowly, the cover stiff from water damage. Most pages were smeared beyond legibility, but near the center, in pencil, was a drawing. 2 stick figures holding hands. One had the word Evan scrawled above it. The other, Aiden. There was no mistaking it now. 2 boys had shared those woods, and at least one had survived long enough to write it down. Jonas stood there in the cold, the notebook trembling slightly in his hands. Scout leaned against his leg, eyes fixed on the hollow. Whatever had happened here wasn't done revealing itself. Not yet. The notebook sat under a glass case now, laid open to the page with the drawing. In the center of the sheriff's evidence room, it looked strangely delicate, almost too personal to be handled with gloves and tweezers. The stick figures were simple, drawn in the unsure lines of a child. Evan had a small smile. Aiden was taller by a few strokes. Around them were rough outlines of trees, and in the corner a crude square that might have been a house, or maybe a cabin. Laura stood behind the glass, arms wrapped tightly around her ribs. Sheriff Griggs hadn't wanted her to see it right away, but Laura insisted. She didn't want information filtered through someone else's voice. She wanted to look directly at what her son might have seen in his final days, and who he might have seen it with. She stared at the names. Evan, Aiden. "I remember him," Laura said quietly. He was in Evan's class, shy. Wore a coat 3 sizes too big. His mom had some sort of health issue, if I recall. They moved out of town not long after Evan disappeared. Griggs nodded slowly. You're sure? Yes. I volunteered in their classroom once a week. Aiden always sat alone. The teacher said he liked drawing, that he got overwhelmed easily. Griggs exhaled through her nose and crossed her arms. He vanished a few weeks after Evan. Different neighborhood, different afternoon. We didn't think to connect the cases back then. But now? Laura asked. We've reopened both files. We're looking for next of kin. His mother passed away 2 years ago in New Mexico. No forwarding information for Aiden, no adoption records, no guardianship filings. As far as official records go, he just disappeared. Laura looked down at the sketch again. Something about it tugged at her. The shape in the corner. The square slightly slanted to one side. Not just a house, a structure. A cabin, she said softly. That looks like a cabin. Or a shack. Griggs looked at her. You think they were there? I think they were hiding, Laura whispered, and someone knew where. For the first time in 12 years, the mystery was no longer just about where Evan had died. It was about who had been with him, and who had kept it quiet. By mid-afternoon, the sun had slipped behind the ridge, casting long blue shadows across the snow-covered forest. Sheriff Griggs, bundled in her heaviest coat, stood beside Ranger Eli Hodges near the edge of a narrow ravine just east of Ridge Hollow. The map he held fluttered in the wind, corners weighted down by rocks. He pointed to a faded trail that no longer appeared on public hiking maps. This used to be a fire access road back in the 70s, Hodges explained. There's an old trapper's cabin about 2 miles in, tucked into a low grove past the east slope. Hasn't been maintained in decades. Locals avoid it. Griggs arched a brow. Because it's remote? Because it's creepy, Hodges replied with a dry laugh. Every town's got a place like that. Kids dare each other to get close, hunters steer clear. It just feels wrong, like something's watching. She didn't roll her eyes, not this time. Too many odd pieces were falling into place, and the word cabin had been echoing since Laura pointed it out in that drawing. If someone had been hiding, that would have been the place to do it. They began the slow descent on snowshoes, following the curve of the ravine until it opened into a thicket of black pines. The path narrowed, branches heavy with old snow arching overhead. Then, after a final bend, they saw it. The cabin squatted low and crooked beneath a heavy roof of ice. Weather-worn wood, dark and splintering, walls leaning as if buckling under the weight of memory. One window had been boarded shut. The other was shattered. The door hung slightly open, creaking gently in the wind. Griggs stepped forward, hand on her sidearm, but there was no sign of movement. Just silence, deep, layered, ancient. Hodges stepped past her and pushed the door inward. Inside, the air was dry and stale. A rusted lantern lay tipped on its side. A child's sneaker rested beneath the window, half buried in dust. In the far corner, a chipped metal tin had been pried open. Crumpled candy wrappers spilled from its side. She took a breath, her voice barely above a whisper. They were here. Sheriff Griggs crouched slowly beside the child's sneaker, her gloved fingers brushing away a thin layer of dust from the toe. It was small, no bigger than her hand, the kind with blinking lights in the heel that no longer worked. She turned it over carefully. The sole was worn thin, and along the inside tag, faded but still visible, was a name written in blue marker. Aiden M. She let out a long breath, her knees aching as she stood. Ranger Hodges had moved to the back wall, where a crude shelf held a few cracked mugs, an old thermos, and what looked like a mildewed deck of cards. He said nothing, just pointed to the floor. Carved into the wood, barely legible, were 4 words. I kept him warm. Griggs moved to join him, her boots creaking on the warped floorboards. The words had been scratched by something sharp, maybe a nail or a pocket knife. They were child-sized, uneven, hesitant. He had tried to save him. Somehow a frightened little boy had found his way here, maybe with Evan or maybe already waiting, and had done everything in his limited power to protect someone else. It wasn't just survival. It was care. It was grief. Behind the cabin, they found the remains of a small fire pit, now packed with snow. Bits of charred cloth and foil poked through the surface. Hodges bent down and tugged gently at something half buried near the stones. It came loose with a snap of brittle fabric, a tiny quilt stitched from mismatched scraps. Griggs recognized it. Laura had described it years ago in her original statement. Evan's comfort blanket, made by his grandmother before she passed. He must have carried it with him when he left school that day. Or maybe Aidan had kept it after Evan died, unable to let it go. Griggs stepped back and looked around the clearing, her breath clouding in the cold. The sky above had gone steel gray again, whispering more snow on the horizon. This place had been a tomb and a refuge, a shelter carved out of desperation. And someone, a boy barely old enough to tie his own shoes, had stayed here long enough to remember how to carve words into wood. And then he had vanished. The cabin door groaned closed behind Sheriff Griggs as she stepped into the snow, her boots crunching softly in the untouched drifts. The clearing around the structure felt like it had been waiting for them. No animal tracks, no human signs, just a pocket of silence held in place for 12 long winters. Ranger Hodges followed a few steps behind, carefully wrapping the quilt in a plastic evidence sleeve. The blanket's stitching was rough, clearly homemade, but someone had taken care of it. The fabric still held the faint outline of little stars, faded but visible. Griggs turned toward him. There was no food, no bedding, nothing permanent. Temporary shelter, maybe, Hodges offered. Enough to survive a few nights, or to hide. She looked back toward the leaning door, her breath rising in sharp bursts. Something didn't sit right. Aidan had been just 7 years old when he vanished, not much older than Evan. Yet somehow he had found this place. Had possibly dragged or led another child here, had kept a fire going, written notes, carved words. She couldn't shake the feeling that someone had helped them, or at least guided them there. Back in town, the old case files on Aidan Marsh were pulled from the archives. Most of it was routine. A basic missing child report filed by his mother, who had claimed Aidan never came home from school. But Griggs noticed something odd. A handwritten amendment added days later, scrawled in different ink. The mother had mentioned a man. "Someone's been bringing him little things," she wrote. "Snacks, trinkets. Said it was a family friend. I thought it was harmless." There had been no follow-up, no description, just a vague note ignored in the swirl of confusion surrounding Evan's case. Griggs stood over the file, lips pressed into a thin line. Aidan hadn't been alone. And maybe neither had Evan, not from the start. She picked up the evidence photo of the stick figure drawing found in the notebook. In the corner, beside the two boys, was a third shape. Taller, featureless. Not a cabin, after all. A person. Someone had been there with them, and that person had never come forward. Laura sat in the sheriff's office conference room, a place she hadn't stepped foot in since the 3rd week of the original search. The walls were the same pale yellow, the carpet still dull and worn in the same high-traffic spots. But the silence in the room felt heavier now, not with anticipation, but with the terrible weight of revelation. Sheriff Griggs laid out the photographs one by one. The quilt, the child's sneaker, the carvings in the cabin floor, the drawing from the notebook. Laura stared at each image without blinking. When the photograph of the stick figures came into view again, her hand moved to it instinctively. "I thought that was a house," she whispered, "but now you think it was a man." Griggs nodded. "We believe someone older may have been with them. Maybe helped them, maybe not." "Helped how?" Laura's voice cracked on the last word. "They were children. One of them died, the other disappeared. We don't know the full picture yet, but we're trying to understand why Aidan never told anyone, why no one came forward, why that note in Evan's pocket said he tried." Laura shook her head slowly, her eyes glassy. "That boy, Aidan, if he carved those words, if he stayed with my son, he didn't do nothing. He did more than anyone else. He stayed." Griggs leaned back in her chair, exhaling through her nose. "There's more." Aidan's mother filed a second statement, back when he vanished. She mentioned a man, said Aidan had been receiving little gifts. Candy, toys, even comic books. She thought it was a friend of the family. Laura's eyes narrowed. Did anyone check into that? Griggs looked down, ashamed. No. At the time, we were overwhelmed. The blizzard, the community pressure, the lack of leads on Evan's case. Aiden's file got buried. Laura stared at the photo again, at the taller shape hovering beside the boys. Not a cabin, not a tree, a person, a shadow, someone who was there but never accounted for. I want to find him, she said quietly. Griggs didn't answer right away. Then she nodded. So do I. The wind howled low across the ridge as Griggs and Deputy Morales returned to the hollow that afternoon, both bundled tightly against the chill. They had received permission to dig further around the perimeter of the original discovery site, this time with forensic oversight. What began as a final pass for overlooked evidence had turned into something more when Scout, restless and tugging at his leash, veered off the flagged area and began barking at a nearby patch of disturbed snow. Morales was the first to reach it. A narrow depression, shallow and partially iced over, sat beneath a cluster of pine saplings. He dropped to one knee and brushed away the snow slowly. Beneath it was a piece of rotted canvas tarp, the edges weighed down by stones. Griggs crouched beside him as he lifted the tarp back, revealing a crude pit. Inside, lined with pine needles and scraps of torn plastic, lay a few more fragments of clothing, child-sized. There were also wrappers, juice boxes, and what looked like the remains of an old sleeping bag rolled tight and stashed in the corner of the shallow shelter. It was a stash, Morales said quietly. Emergency supplies, maybe. Griggs nodded but said nothing. Her eyes had locked on something tucked beneath the plastic lining. She reached for it carefully and pulled free a small, weather-beaten notebook. Different from the one found earlier. This one was handmade, pages bound with string, its cover constructed from a flattened cereal box. Inside were drawings, dozens of them. Stick figures, landscapes, stars, animals. Some pages were water-stained, but others had survived. One image stopped her cold. It was a drawing of the same cabin they had found earlier, with two children standing inside and a taller figure outside the door, looming, drawn in thick, dark pencil. But it was the final page that sent a chill through her. It simply read, I saw him again last night. Same coat, same smell. He watches when we sleep. No name, no explanation, just that. Griggs closed the notebook slowly, her fingers stiff. This wasn't just a case of two boys lost in a storm. Someone had been hunting in those woods, and one of them had known it. The photograph lay on the corner of Laura's kitchen table, half-shadowed by the afternoon light slanting through the blinds. It was the one from Evan's first-grade class, the same one the sheriff's office had been using to match faces and names. Laura had studied it so many times now that every child's expression was etched into her mind. But her focus was fixed on the edge of the photo, on the boy with the dark hair and unsure posture, only partially in frame. Aiden Marsh. He was barely recognizable, not because of age or blur, but because he looked like he didn't belong there. Like someone who had been placed beside the group just long enough to be remembered, then pulled away again before the shutter clicked. She reached for her phone and called Sheriff Griggs. There's something odd about the way Aiden's standing, Laura said, like he didn't want to be in the photo, or like someone didn't want him too close. Griggs was quiet on the other end. We've been looking into school records. Turns out Aiden had only been enrolled for a few months before he disappeared. Transferred in late, right after moving from Gunnison. And his mother. She had some history. Laura leaned forward. What kind of history? Reported a few incidents of strange men showing up at their home. Once claimed someone had left a package for Aiden on their porch, comic books and candy. Said it happened more than once. But no name, no arrest. It was dismissed. Laura's stomach twisted. Did Aiden ever talk about it? Only to one person, Griggs replied. His teacher. She retired years ago, but we found her, Ms. Langston. She remembered Aiden clearly. Said he used to draw a man in a long brown coat with no face. Over and over again. Said that's who followed him to school. Laura looked down at her son's smile in the photo. Innocent, unaware. "Do you think this man is the one who brought them to the cabin?" she asked. "I think he may have brought Aiden there first," Griggs said, "and Evan just got caught in the storm." For the first time, Laura saw it not as an accident, but as an intersection, a collision with something already in motion. By the time Griggs reached the outskirts of Gunnison, the sun had dipped below the horizon, and the sky had taken on that slate-gray tint that came just before another snowfall. She pulled into a narrow driveway beside a weathered one-story home with chipping paint and a sagging porch. The woman who answered the door was frail, her frame hunched with age and fatigue, but her eyes were sharp. "You're here about Aiden," she said, not asking but stating. Her name was Margaret Langston, retired teacher, keeper of forgotten names, and the last adult to see Aiden Marsh every day before he vanished. Griggs nodded and stepped inside. The living room smelled of dust and tea. Shelves lined with photo albums and stacks of old graded papers filled the space, a shrine to decades spent shaping young minds. "He was a quiet boy," Margaret said, settling into an armchair. "Smart. Watchful. He didn't speak much unless it was to answer a direct question, and even then his voice was soft, like he expected someone to shush him." "Did he ever mention being followed?" Griggs asked. Margaret looked out the window, her fingers tightening around her teacup. "Yes, not in those words, but he drew the same figure over and over again. A tall man in a brown coat, no eyes, no mouth. Just standing behind a tree or looking through a window. I asked him once who it was, and he said, 'The man who brings me things.'" Griggs felt the chill settle in her spine. "I told his mother," Margaret continued. She brushed it off. Said Aiden had an active imagination, but there was a look in her eyes like she knew exactly who he meant and was too scared to name him. Griggs set a small evidence photo on the table, the notebook drawing from the hollow. The cabin, 2 boys, and the faceless figure. Margaret stared at it for a long time. "That's him. That's the one." "Do you think Aiden ever mentioned where this place was?" Griggs asked. Margaret shook her head slowly. "No. But he once asked me if people could live in the woods forever as long as no one remembered them." That silence returned to the room. Griggs knew then. Someone had made sure to be forgotten. Sheriff Griggs drove the long road back to Pine Hollow in silence, her headlights cutting through the snow that had begun falling in slow, deliberate flakes. Her thoughts looped in quiet rhythm, returning again and again to the words Margaret Langston had spoken. "The man who brings me things." The way Aiden had drawn him, the fear etched into lines too young to carry that weight. Back at the station, Deputy Morales was waiting with an update. He led her into the back conference room, where a corkboard had been covered with printouts, photographs, and a topographical map of the forest surrounding Ridge Hollow. Lines had been drawn in red, marking old cabins, ranger stations, fire roads long since overgrown. One pin stood out near the far northeast quadrant, far beyond the boundaries of the search conducted 12 years ago. "An old ranger supply shelter," Morales said. "Built in the late 60s, condemned in the 80s after a bear incident. It was never demolished. We pulled satellite images. Looks like it's still standing. No official record of it being used since." Griggs stared at the pin. It was deeper than the cabin they'd already found. Farther from the trail system. If someone wanted to disappear, to live just outside of society's reach, it would be a perfect hiding place. "We think it might be connected?" she asked. Morales hesitated. "We cross-referenced all known sex offender records within a 100-mile radius of Pine Hollow from that time. One name stood out. Dean Rodell, former Forest Service employee. Lived in Gunnison for 5 years under an alias. Disappeared without a trace in early 2011. Griggs swallowed hard. "That's just a year after Evan and Aiden vanished." Morales nodded. "We found an old license registration linked to his alias. The address he used was fake, but we confirmed he had a trail permit registered in his real name 2 months before Evan disappeared. It listed that shelter as a stop." A slow unease crept into Griggs's chest. She looked back at the drawing, the tall figure watching from the edge of the trees. The boys hadn't stumbled into the woods by accident. They had followed someone. And now they might finally know who. The snow was falling harder by the time Griggs and Morales reached the trailhead. A narrow ranger road, barely passable even with chains on the tires, led them into the thickest part of the forest northeast of Ridge Hollow. The trees here were denser, older, and the silence between them felt heavier than it had in other parts of the woods, as if something had settled here a long time ago and never left. They parked the vehicle at a bend in the road and continued on foot. Scout had been brought along again, his leash held firmly in Morales's gloved hand. The dog sniffed the air, alert but cautious, as if sensing the shift in the terrain. It took nearly 40 minutes of trudging through knee-high drifts before the shelter finally came into view. It stood crooked at the edge of a narrow clearing, half sunken into the frozen ground, its roof caved slightly on one side. The structure was wood and stone, old fire service construction from a time when men lived off maps and instinct. The windows had been boarded over from the inside. The door was shut but not locked. Griggs stepped forward first. She pushed gently on the door, and it gave way with a low groan, revealing a room swallowed by dust and shadow. The air inside was thick with rot. Mice had nested in the corners, and decaying bedding lined the perimeter of the floor. But there were signs of habitation: cracked bowls, tin food cans, empty bottles. In the center of the room sat a rusted metal stove and a chair, missing one leg, propped against the wall. Morales pulled out his flashlight and scanned the shelves. Tucked between a stack of yellowing magazines and a broken lantern was a small wooden box. He lifted the lid carefully. Inside were items that didn't belong here: a child's toothbrush, a pair of small socks, still rolled together, a cracked plastic comb with the name Aiden faintly scratched into the handle. Griggs felt her breath catch. Someone had kept these things. Not as trophies, as reminders. The past wasn't buried here. It had been living quietly, in the dark, waiting for someone to return. The shelter smelled of mildew and smoke, a stale mixture that clung to the walls like residue from another life. Sheriff Griggs moved carefully around the room, eyes scanning every corner. It wasn't just the child's items that unsettled her. It was how deliberately they'd been kept. Nothing strewn, nothing broken in haste. Everything tucked away with purpose, like someone had returned here often, like someone had remembered. Morales continued searching the perimeter while Scout sniffed near the back wall, ears pinned forward. The dog scratched at a loose floorboard near the edge of the stove. Griggs knelt beside him and pried the board loose. Beneath it was a narrow crawl space, no more than 2 feet deep, lined with flattened cardboard boxes. Inside, wrapped in a plastic grocery bag, were several items long forgotten by time but unmistakable in meaning. A stack of Polaroids. Most were water-damaged, curled at the edges, but one had survived. It showed 2 boys sitting on the steps of a wooden structure. Evan was unmistakable. His red mittens and crooked smile burned into Griggs's memory. Beside him, slightly older, thinner, was Aiden. He wasn't smiling. Behind them stood a figure, just out of focus. Tall, dressed in layers, a hood pulled low over his head. No face visible, just the outline of a man watching 2 children too closely. Griggs's stomach turned as she flipped through the rest of the bag. A matchbook from a gas station outside Gunnison, a journal with torn pages. A crumpled note written in the same childlike handwriting as before. He says the snow hides things. He says, I'm lucky he picked me. Griggs felt cold, despite the layers she wore. She stood and looked around the cabin again, every creak and shadow now thick with implication. Dean Ruddle hadn't just been hiding, he'd been visiting. Maybe even living nearby in bursts, returning to this place like it was sacred. Morales stepped back into the doorway, his face pale. There's a trail behind the shelter. Looks like it leads deeper. Fresh tracks, too, not more than a few days old. Griggs didn't move. For the first time, she knew they weren't chasing a memory. They were chasing someone still out there. The trail behind the shelter wound uphill, narrow and overgrown, as if the forest had been trying to reclaim it for years. Griggs and Morales followed in silence, their breath fogging in the freezing air, Scout trotting ahead with ears twitching at every noise. The tracks were faint but visible boot prints, uneven in stride, weaving between trees. Whoever had walked this way hadn't been careful, or hadn't expected anyone to follow. They moved slowly, each step deliberate. The snow muffled sound, but the deeper they climbed, the more the forest seemed to listen. Even the birds had fallen quiet. After nearly 20 minutes, the trail opened into a small clearing. There, half buried beneath a sagging tarp, stood a structure barely more than a shack. It leaned against a cluster of rocks, its roof patched with sheet metal, smoke faintly rising from a rusted stovepipe. Griggs lifted her hand, signaling for Morales to hold back. She approached quietly, stepping just off the trail to avoid crunching snow. Her fingers hovered near her weapon, breath slow and steady. She could hear something inside movement, faint and rhythmic, someone pacing, maybe talking. She edged closer to the window and peered through a crack between two planks. A man stood inside. Mid-60s, weathered face, wiry frame. He was stirring something on the stove, humming low under his breath. The space was cluttered with stacked tins, bags of jerky, a portable radio, and in the corner, hanging on the wall, were more Polaroids, not just of Evan and Aiden, others, unnamed children, smiling, blurry, afraid. Griggs stepped back, heart pounding. She turned to Morales and whispered, "It's him." Morales pulled out his radio. "We need backup. Immediate. Cabin located. Suspect in residence. Armed status, unknown." As they waited, crouched in the snow, the wind shifted. The humming inside stopped. Then the door creaked open. The man stepped out slowly, squinting toward the trees as if sensing a change. His hand hovered near his coat pocket, where something weighted the fabric unnaturally. Griggs stood and drew her weapon. "Dean Ruddell," she called out, "hands where I can see them." He froze, not in surprise, but recognition, like he'd been expecting this day to come. Dean Ruddell didn't reach for his pocket, not right away. His eyes flicked to the trees behind Griggs, then to Morales standing further back, hand on his sidearm. He raised his arm slowly, palms out, but there was no fear in his expression, only weariness, as if this moment had been long overdue. "I was just heating soup," he said, voice hoarse, weathered by years of silence. Griggs didn't move. "Step away from the cabin." Now, he obeyed, shuffling into the snow with slow, deliberate steps. His boots left deep indentations behind him, heavy and erratic, just like the trail they'd followed. As he reached the center of the clearing, Griggs kept her weapon trained on him, heart thudding with controlled urgency. "I didn't kill that boy," Ruddell said. "I didn't lay a hand on him." Griggs narrowed her eyes. "But you knew he died." "I tried to help him," he said, lowering his gaze. Both of them. Morales stepped forward and secured Ruddell's wrists, patting him down before retrieving a folding knife from his coat pocket. No gun, no resistance. Griggs exhaled slowly, tension still coiled tight beneath her ribs. Inside the cabin, everything told a different story. Faded drawings lined the inner walls, more of the same hand that had left messages in the cabin near Ridge Hollow. Names written and scratched out. Aiden. Evan. Others unfamiliar. Bits of belongings, trophies, or keepsakes carefully arranged and stored in rusted tins. They found a logbook beneath the mattress. Dozens of entries in tight, cramped handwriting. Some names matched missing persons cases. Others had no surnames, only ages, dates, and brief notes. Aiden, age 7. Quiet, watches me closely. Likes stories. Evan, age 6. Lost, cold, didn't eat much. Griggs stood at the door of the shack, staring at the forest that stretched endlessly in every direction. The wind had picked up again, sending flurries skittering across the snow like whispers. Morales led Ruddell to the vehicle in silence. He didn't speak again, didn't ask questions, just kept looking behind him as if someone might still be watching from the trees. Griggs knew this wasn't over. Not yet. Because there was still one question no one had answered. What happened to Aiden Marsh? The interrogation room at the sheriff's office was quiet except for the hum of the overhead light and the occasional scratch of Griggs's pen against her notebook. Dean Rodell sat across the table, wrists cuffed, his eyes downcast. He hadn't spoken since they brought him in. Not when Morales read him his rights. Not when they laid the photos of Evan and Aiden in front of him. But now, with no noise left to hide behind, his voice came low and flat. "I didn't take them," he said. "They found me." Griggs didn't answer right away. She let the silence stretch until it made the air feel heavier. "They were just boys," she said finally. 6 and 7. "You expect me to believe they wandered into a forest and just happened upon you?" Rodell looked up. "Evan didn't come to me. Aiden did. He knew where I was. Someone had told him. I think he wanted to get away." Griggs narrowed her eyes. "From what?" Rodell hesitated. "Then, his mom, her boyfriend. There was yelling all the time. She wasn't well. He'd show up at my camp sometimes, asking questions. I never hurt him. I gave him food. Taught him how to stay warm, how to listen to the trees. That winter, he came one day dragging the other boy behind him. Said Evan got lost, and he couldn't just leave him." Griggs's throat tightened. "And then what?" "They stayed a few nights. I gave them blankets, built a fire. I didn't think they'd last long, not in that storm. I tried to get them to go back." "You didn't contact anyone?" "No," he said. "I was off the grid for a reason. I didn't want anyone looking at me again." Griggs leaned forward. "And Evan?" Rodell's voice cracked. "He got sick. Couldn't stop shaking. Aiden held him all night. When I woke up, he was gone. Cold as stone." Griggs swallowed hard. "And Aiden?" "I buried Evan." Aiden watched. He didn't cry, just stared at the snow. The next morning, he was gone too. "Gone where?" "I don't know," Rodell whispered. But Griggs wasn't sure she believed him. Because someone like Aiden didn't just vanish, not without a reason. The morning after Rodell's confession, Laura sat on the back porch of her home, the cold seeping through the blanket draped across her shoulders. The sky above Pine Hollow was overcast again, and a light snow had begun to fall. Everything looked the same, yet nothing felt familiar. The truth she had begged for, prayed for, waited over a decade to hear, had finally surfaced. But it hadn't brought peace, only more questions. Evan had died in the woods, yes, but not alone, not abandoned. Aiden had stayed. A child barely 7 years old had sheltered her son, buried him, then disappeared without a trace. That part haunted her more than anything. The way no one had searched for him. The way his name had vanished from records, from memories, as if he had been allowed to slip through the cracks because no one thought to keep his story alive. Her fingers trembled as she pulled the photograph of the 2 boys from her coat pocket. The Polaroid recovered from the hidden shelter. Evan's smile was lopsided, his cheeks smudged with dirt, but his eyes were still bright. Aiden sat beside him, thinner, unsmiling, his eyes locked on the person taking the photo. He hadn't looked afraid. He had looked resigned. Sheriff Griggs had called earlier with updates. Rodell remained in custody, awaiting transport to a secure facility. No formal charges had been filed yet, but the investigation was growing. There were other photographs, other items. Griggs believed more children might have passed through that cabin, survivors maybe, others who had never been reported missing. But what she didn't have, what no one had, was a lead on Aiden Marsh. 12 years ago, he had vanished after the blizzard. But someone had seen him more recently. A retired hunter who claimed a few years back that he'd spotted a young man camping deep in the woods north of Gunnison. Said the boy kept to himself, moved like a shadow, and vanished before anyone could get close. At the time, no one thought much of it. Now, Laura couldn't stop thinking about it. Because if Aiden had survived, then maybe he was still out there. And maybe, just maybe, he was waiting to be found too. It was nearly dusk when the tip came in. A forestry worker named Kenny Bray had been checking soil levels along the northern slope of the San Isabel Range when he spotted movement through his binoculars. A figure, lean and agile, slipping between trees at the tree line near an abandoned fire watch tower. The sight would have meant nothing if not for what he noticed next. The person wore layers of mismatched clothing and carried a patched canvas satchel. More than that, he moved like someone used to avoiding attention. Sheriff Griggs was at the site within an hour, this time with a quiet determination in her step. The watchtower was old, condemned years ago, its stairs crumbling and rust streaking the supports. But tucked beneath it, where rock met snow, was a small lean-to. Smoke still curled from a vent pipe, half buried in pine branches. They approached with caution, announcing themselves just once before drawing close. A soft voice called back, "Don't shoot." Griggs paused. The voice was male, young but older than she expected, and steady. From the lean-to, a young man emerged slowly. Late teens, maybe 20. His hair was shaggy and matted beneath a wool cap, his face sharp with hunger but calm. He looked at Griggs without fear, eyes flicking to her badge, then to the photograph she held out, Aidan Marsh. He studied it for a long time, then nodded. "It's me," he said. Morales stepped forward carefully. "Are you hurt?" Aidan shook his head. "I'm fine. I didn't think anyone would still be looking." Griggs exhaled, the air catching in her throat. "We never stopped." Back at the station, Aidan sat in a warm room for the first time in years. He answered their questions with patience, though his voice stayed quiet. Yes, he had buried Evan. Yes, he had stayed alive in the woods, learned to survive. He said Dean Ruddell hadn't touched him, but that he had always felt watched, always known it wasn't safe to go home. When asked why he stayed away all these years, he looked down at his hands. "Because no one ever came for me before." Griggs looked him in the eye. "We're here now." Snow fell softly outside the Pine Hollow courthouse as Aidan Marsh stepped onto the sidewalk, wrapped in a borrowed coat, his shoulders hunched more from habit than cold. Reporters had gathered, cameras angled low, waiting to catch a glimpse of the boy who had once disappeared into the storm and returned a man. But there was no spectacle in him, no grand statement, just quiet steps and eyes that had seen too much. Inside, Dean Ruddell had been formally charged, multiple counts stemming not just from Evan's case, but from other cold files reopened in light of the evidence found in his cabin. Survivors had come forward. Names once forgotten were spoken aloud again. It would take time, but there was a sense that something long buried had finally cracked open and let light through. Laura stood across the street, watching Aidan with tears that refused to fall. She had asked to see him, not to ask questions, but to say thank you. When they finally stood face to face in the sheriff's office earlier that week, she hadn't expected words to come, but he had spoken first. "I tried to keep him warm," Aidan had said softly, the same words he had carved into the cabin floor. "I did my best." She had simply reached for his hand, held it. That had been enough. Now Aidan was heading to a transitional care home, a safe place outside of town where he could sleep in a real bed and learn how to live among people again. Griggs had arranged for counseling, for a fresh start. She didn't know if he would stay. The forest had become his home, his protector and his prison. But for the first time in 12 years, he wasn't alone. The town, once fractured by tragedy, had begun to bend toward healing. There would always be scars, but there was also the truth now. And in that truth, something powerful had taken root. A boy had vanished in the blizzard. But a young man had come back. And though the storm had taken much, it hadn't taken everything. Not the memory, not the hope, and not the last of what was still worth saving.